Yeah.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. It is a great honor. Oh, good evening again. Thank you so much for joining us. It is a great honor to welcome you all. And I want to begin by, first of all, always thanking our gracious hostess, Eliza Fishman, who has been, I don't want to call her a game show hostess, but sometimes that's what I feel, sort of like managing the board and setting up all the arrangements before, during, and after these productions. It may seem like it doesn't require a lot of work and effort, but it does, and it's just incredible commitment on Eliza's part. So thank you, Eliza. I also want to acknowledge the virtual presence of Rabbi Neil Turk, who's my colleague from Yeshiva, who works closely with the members of the Kol Elyon. I'm sure he's here not to spy, but really just to learn together with the rest of us. But it is a real honor to welcome him this evening. And of course, it is a great privilege and an honor to introduce our guest, Rabbi Scott Hoberman. Rabbi Hoberman grew up in Chicago, and he spent 2 years studying at Yeshiva Shalvim prior to completing his BA in mathematics at Yeshiva University. He served for 4 years as part of the Riverdale Jewish Center rabbinic team as rabbinic intern and then assistant rabbi. And after receiving his smicha from REITs, he joined the very prestigious Bella and Harry Wexner Kol Elyon, which provides advanced rabbinic training, and where he is currently a 4th-year fellow. Thank you, Rabbi Hoberman, not just for joining us this evening and for giving of your time and your wisdom, but just in general for what you do on part of the community. Rabbi Hoberman, actually, I got this bio. There's a lot more to add that's not on here. I'll just share one more thing off script, and that is that Rabbi Hoberman, together with his friend and colleague Rabbi Yitzhak Ganak, started a fascinating podcast, which is called, I think, Drusha Deconstructed. I only really know about it because I was interviewed once, but after that point, I was sort of hooked, and I really loved the idea. But just a very fascinating, creative concept. But just an idea of the creative energy and interest and really commitment to our Batzis Torah in very, very unique ways. Rabbi Hoberman, it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you for that, Rabbi Rothwax. Thank you, Mrs. Fishman, for helping set everything up, and thank you, Rabbi Turk, for arranging this entire Wexner lecture series from all the different Wexner fellows with the different shuls throughout the area. And thank you all of you for joining tonight. So our topic this evening is going to be the impact of archaeological findings on the halachic process. And though the title is a little bit wordy, the reason I was careful with the words I used in choosing the title was to make sure that it's clear what we're not going to be discussing this evening. Because one of the things that the importance of archaeology in Judaism, perhaps one of the most notable topics that one could give a lecture on, is really that Israel is really one of the archaeological hotspots in the world, that every archaeological discovery in Israel has significance. Israel's a very historic land. Every finding there has religious implications, political implications, and the archaeological work that's done in Israel is very politicized somewhat, and some of the archaeologists have an agenda, either to prove the biblical narrative, to disprove the biblical narrative. So we're not going to be discussing any of that. What we are going to be discussing are findings in archaeology that have impact on the halachic process. We know that every discipline has its rules and how a discipline should work. And within the halachic process, there's a big discussion how we should view archaeological findings. When we have a halachic debate, we find some sort of evidence from an earlier generation that seems to shed light on one of the sides of the debate. So how do we bring that into the equation? So there were 3 reasons that really I chose this topic to discuss with you tonight. One reason is that I feel that this question of archaeology and halacha is very much a Torah Umada topic. It's very much a Yeshiva University type of topic, that it's an idea of using something, a secular finding, a secular discipline, and incorporating that into the world of Torah, into the world of halacha. Second, more whimsical reason why I was thinking of this, as when Rabbi Turk asked me to think of a topic, that day I was helping my daughter, my 4-year-old daughter, color some pictures that she has, and she was asking me what color she should color her dinosaur. I was really thinking about it and wondering how, we don't really know what color dinosaurs were, and started researching that question, which made me thinking about this topic a little more. And thirdly, I was a student in Rav Schechter's shir in YU. I was in Rav Schechter's shir for 3 years, Rav Hershel Schechter. And Rav Schechter is somewhat known for his opinion on this topic. Rav Schechter notably wears the tcheles strings. We know that there's a mitzvah of wearing tzitzis for all Jewish men. And the Torah tells us, that on your tzitzis string, there should be at least one that is tcheles, that is colored with a blue color. Our tradition tells us that it has to be colored from a certain species of fish, the chilazon. And about 2,000 years ago, we lost the identity of the chilazon. We no longer knew what aquatic species the tcheles came from. And for over 1,000 years, nobody wore tcheles on their tzitzis strings. And Rav Schechter is one of the poskim who prominently wears the tcheles string. Rav Schechter feels that the evidence that's been discovered to claim that the Murex trunculus, which is a snail type of creature, is the identity of the chilazon and is the correct tcheles. Rav Schechter feels that we should follow that and people should wear the tcheles strings. Others are less convinced and even question whether the archaeology should be brought into the equation. So that's another reason why this shir is dear to me. And lastly, either the last parsha we read before we entered the social distancing world, or for some of us, the first parsha that we didn't read, was the parsha of Kisisa. And in Parshas Kisisa, there's a comment of the Ramban that I'm going to begin our discussion with that seems to have to deal with this question. And the Ramban, in his Chidushim al Torah, and his commentary to the Chumash, the Ramban has, if you've ever learned Ramban al Torah, you'll know that there are certain ones, people even print lists of which are the Rambans that you should really see. So this isn't exactly one of them. It's somewhat of a dry discussion that the Ramban has about the shekel. Parshas Kisisa starts with the Machatzis HaShekel, and the Ramban has a discussion, what is the exact weight of the shekel? The shekel is a certain amount of weight of silver. There's a system of currency in the Torah and in the Halachic literature, a system of weights, and the Ramban tries to gather the different opinions to do the math as to figuring out exactly how heavy was the shekel that the Torah is referring to. And the Ramban, he quotes two opinions. He quotes the Rashi, he quotes the Rif, and if you go through the Ramban al Torah, you probably would gloss over this one. It's not so interesting unless maybe you're learning Maseches Shkalim at the same time. But there's in some of the Rambans, it's printed as a footnote, some it's printed in the back. But the Ramban later in his life, after he completed his work of the Ramban al Torah, the Ramban actually made his way to Israel later in his life, and he actually adds a couple of addendums to his Ramban al Torah. He has a famous essay where he discusses some of the map of Israel and where exactly the Ramah is and some other places in Israel, that once he arrived there, he figured out where they were. And he has a comment here adding to his discussion about the shekel. And what he shares with us, he tells us that when he made his way to Israel, that there were people there who showed him that they had found a shekel, that was from 1,000 years beforehand. And he wasn't sure exactly what this coin was to know if it was a shekel or not. It had some sort of lettering on it. It wasn't written with the Hebrew letters that we're accustomed to. So he says in this essay that he brought it to the Kusim, the Kutites who were there, and they interpreted for him. They read to him that it said shekel HaKodesh and something Yerushalayim, and they showed him that it was the shekel, and the Ramban accepted their report. He weighed the shekel, and he said that it weighed exactly the opinion that Rashi says. He says, you see from this experience of the shekel that he found, he says we have a clear proof that Rashi seems to have been correct regarding the weight of the shekel. So what we're going to discuss, and we realize, is it's not just a question of the last 100 years of identifying the Murex trunculus and the chilazon to figure out the tcheles, but this is really a discussion that began even 800 years ago in the times of the Ramban, that the Ramban is willing to rely on some sort of an archaeological discovery in order to, and bring that into the equation of psak halacha. And we'll see as we go through, as I discuss some of the sources, we'll see that maybe why there may be reason to question bringing archaeology into the halachic process. So this is the example that brought me to giving this shir. The Rav Schechter, if you've ever heard a shir by Rav Schechter, what Rav Schechter is known to do, for those who've been in his shir and study his words closely, is Rav Schechter will also often just quote a source or two on a topic, and you feel like you have an understanding of the topic, but really you really need to dig much deeper, and you, pardon the pun, dig deeper and see the other sources and realize that the things that Rav Schechter says really have a lot of depth to them, and sometimes something he seems to express as one opinion could really be something that's a big chiddush, a novel interpretation, and others may disagree. So Rav Schechter likes to quote a Gemara in Bava Basra, where the Gemara tells a story of Rabba Bar Chama, who claims that he was going through the Sinai desert. He was in the desert with some sort of an Arab tour guide. And the tour guide told him, he said, I'm going to show you the Mesei Midbar. I'll show you the Jews who died in the wilderness when they were leaving Mitzrayim on their path to Israel. He said, we've discovered some of their grave sites, and I'll show them to you. So this holy Amora, Rabbi Bar Chama, was brought to the kever of these Jews who had left Egypt and died in the desert. And the Gemara tells us he tried to take their tzitzis from them to bring them home back as a specimen, and he was unable to do so. That once he cut off some of the garments, they were no longer able to walk. He had to put them back, and he ended up leaving empty-handed. And when he made his way back to, I guess, the Beis Medrash, back to the yeshiva, he told the other sages about his experience, and the sages criticized him. They said, you fool. Why? You didn't need to cut the tzitzis off. What were you trying to figure out? Presumably, you were trying to figure out a halachic inquiry that we had in the Beis Medrash, I guess, the other week, that there's a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel regarding the amount of strings we have on our tzitzis. So those of us who wear tzitzis know that tzitzis is made up of 4 strings. The 4 strings are bent to appear as 8 strings. But this is really the opinion of Beis Hillel. The opinion of Beis Shammai held that there are really 3 strings bent over to make 6. And the sages told Rami Bar Chama, obviously you were going to investigate to figure out from the Mesei Midbar, those who died in the desert, how they wore tzitzis too. The Torah had been given already. So you were trying to figure out how many strings did they have to resolve this machlokas. And they told him there was no need for you to bring back a specimen. You could have just looked and told us. And the Gemara ends with that, with this criticism of Rami Bar Chama that he should have just looked and reported back to the Beis Medrash in order to resolve the question of how many strings should be on a tzitzis garment. And Rav Schechter likes to quote this Gemara in saying that you see that the Gemara was willing and even encouraged searching for archaeological evidence. That if we wouldn't accept archaeological evidence, then there was no reason for Rami Bar Chama to look at their strings or to bring them back. Clearly, that's something that was important and integral to the halachic process. That if we were able to uncover the historical truth, we would have brought that into the equation for halacha. So this is the source that Rav Schechter likes to quote when he discusses the sugya of tchelas. But I saw that others actually disagree with his interpretation. Others say that no, the whole point of that Gemara is to show us not to accept archaeological evidence. That the point of the Gemara is that hashgacha of halacha, that God involves himself in the halachic process. That there are certain things that God wants the Jewish people and the rabbis of each generation to fight about and to figure out, and doesn't want to get involved. That we have a famous Gemara with the Tanur Shalachnai, a machlokas, very technical machlokas in Tuma B'Tara between Rabbi Eliezer and the other sages. And Rabbi Eliezer attempts to prove his position by bending the trees and having this water flow upstream and bending the walls of the Beis HaMedrash, and even having a heavenly voice proclaim that his position is correct. And the Gemara concludes, Lo Bashamayim, it's not up to the heavens. The Torah was given to mankind, to the sages of each generation to flesh out and argue each position and figure out what the halacha should be. We don't go to the heavens. We don't look for other sources. So some of the more contemporary poskim disagree with Rav Schechter. They say the same way that Lo Bashamayim, we won't listen to a heavenly proclamation in order to figure out the halacha. So we also won't listen to archaeological evidence. We don't care about what people find, and that's why God wouldn't allow Rami Bar Chama to bring back this piece of evidence to the Beis Medrash, even though it was quite obvious he could have just looked at the strings. But the fact that he wasn't successful in doing so shows that we shouldn't really accept archaeological evidence. So this is a source that we have in the Gemara. But there's another, that's more of a Gadata Gemara. It's not really, the Gemara isn't necessarily, it's hard to know when you learn Agadatas and stories like this, it's to be taken literally, that he actually saw these graves. We don't know of any graves in the desert from the Jews who were in the desert at the time. There's another Gemara that's actually paskined by the Rambam, which might be important for our discussion. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Samach Gimel and Beis, discusses the tzitz. The tzitz is the head plate that the Kohen Gadol wore. the Kohen Gadol had particular garments in addition to the Kohanim. In addition to those, one wore the Kohanim. Sometimes he wore the Kohanim's garments. Sometimes he had his unique garments of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And his tzitz had the words Kodesh LaHashem engraved on the tzitz. And the Gemara quotes a Machlokas Tanaim as to how the words Kodesh LaHashem, which are written in the Psukim, but how were they engraved on the tzitz? Were they engraved in one line or were they engraved in two lines? One opinion says they were written in one line, one says they were written in two lines. And the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi proclaims, Ani ra'isi be'ir Romi. I was in the city of Rome and I saw the tzitz. I don't know if it was in the Vatican, exactly where the tzitz was stored, but Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi claims that he saw the tzitz, and he says, V'kasav Kodesh LaHashem b'shita achas. And I saw that Kodesh LaHashem was written in one line. So most of us, if we see this Gemara, seems pretty clear that the rabbi was willing to rely on a finding that he had. This may have been, I don't think it would make much of a difference whether you find it, in the museum versus whether you find it underground, but he found the tzitz. He was able to discern, figure out if it was one line or two lines, and he reports that it's recorded in the Gemara. But the Rambam, surprisingly, in Hilchos Klei HaMikdash, where he describes the vestments of the Kohanim, he tells us that the tzitz was written Shnei Shitin, Kodesh Milmata LaHashem Milmala. It was written actually in two lines, Kodesh LaHashem, in two separate lines, despite the fact that the Gemara concludes that Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi found the tzitz and saw that it was written in one line. Now, to be fair, the Rambam adds to that after he says that it should be written in two lines. He says, and if it were written in one line, it would still be kosher. So, meaning the Rambam, if you ask the Rambam, how should we construct the tzitz? It's Hashem, when we build the Beis HaMikdash again, we'll wonder how do we construct the tzitz. The Rambam would paskin it should be done in two separate lines, despite the fact that the Gemara told us that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yossi found the tzitz and it only had one line in it. So the Rambam, I think he's dealing with that Gemara as well. The Rambam tells us that no, it can be written in one line. It would still be valid if it were written in one line, just that it preferably should be written in two lines. So he didn't necessarily throw out the evidence that the Gemara brought. He incorporated that into the halacha, saying that it would be valid if it was one line, but he still didn't feel like that was a reason to follow that opinion la halacha, and he poskened that it should be two separate lines. So in trying to understand why someone would, ignore archaeological evidence in the halachic process, it helps us to understand the field of archaeology a little bit better and to understand some of the pitfalls in the secular archaeological process. And I'd like to do that with you by sharing two examples in history of, mistakes that were made based on archaeological findings. There are some notable mistakes. I tried to choose some that people probably wouldn't have heard of. And the first I'd like to do, I had a way to share my screen. It doesn't seem to be working. The first I'd like to share is called the Rodejun mummy. I'll try to show this picture just on this paper I have here. Here's a mummy here, the Rodejun mummy that was found in the year 2000. And this mummy was discovered in Pakistan, and it made quite a stir in the world of archaeology and was actually a news story at the time as well. And the reason why this finding was so fascinating, it was actually not found by an archaeologist. It was found by the police in Pakistan. And they found it by somebody was trying to sell this mummy on the black market. And the police, they were tipped off to somebody trying to sell a mummy in the black market. I don't know if you put a mummy up on eBay, the police are probably gonna knock on your door, figure out what's going on there. So they found this person who was selling this mummy, and when they arrested, he was trying to sell it for $11 million. This what was known as the Rodejun mummy. And when they arrested him and took a look at this mummy, so they realized they had something interesting on their hands here, and they called the local museum, and the museum sent somebody, I guess, from the archaeology department or in the museum. And when they investigated this mummy, they were shocked because the mummy was mummified in the Egyptian manner, how Egyptian mummies are mummified, but it was found in Pakistan. And there had never been a mummy found in Pakistan that was mummified in the Egyptian way. They were looking at it further, they discovered it had a name on it. The name was Rodejun, that's why it's called the Rodejun mummy. Rhodesiune is the daughter of Xerxes, one of the kings of Persia. So the Rhodesiune mummy was nicknamed the Persian princess. This was apparently the daughter of one of the kings of Persia, which was mummified in an Egyptian way. They had no records. No one ever knew that the Persians would mummify it in an Egyptian way, and they were absolutely shocked. And this was a news story. It immediately went to the museum, and the historians and the archaeologists were trying to piece together the history. How exactly did the Persians learn how to mummify like the Egyptians? Did they send the body to Egypt, have it mummified, and bring it back? Did they somehow learn the Egyptian method? There was a whole hullabaloo in the archaeology and history world trying to figure out how this could have happened. But what ultimately ended up happening was when they continued to investigate this, and months later, they were actually disappointed to find out that something was very wrong here. They realized that the some sort of a carpet, something that the mummy was on, when they aged that, they realized that it was the way that it was sewn or crocheted, however you make a carpet, it couldn't possibly have been done in the 2,000 years ago. It didn't match the time in history that this mummy should have been. And when they did further studies on the body, they were horrified to find out that this body was not thousands of years old. There were ligaments that should have been deteriorated by then. They realized that the body was actually only 5 years old, and that this was some tremendous hoax. It ended up being just a little gory, but ended up being some sort of like a murder mystery, trying to figure out whose body this was, how this happened, who did this. I don't think the mystery was ever solved, but the mummy was removed from the museum, actually given a proper burial, and they realized they'd been hoaxed. Something had gone wrong here. And one of the lessons that this story teaches us is that it's very easy to get carried away by a finding in archaeology and come to conclusions, but your conclusions are only as valid as the trust that you're putting in the people who are making these discoveries. This example was one where the archaeologists were tricked. There are other examples in history, the Piltdown Man, if you're familiar, where the archaeologists were actually the ones trying to trick their colleagues and peers. And when these sort of scandals happen, it sets the science and history world off on a wild goose chase trying to figure things out. But really, the evidence is false. That your evidence is really only as good as the person who's supplying it. So I bring this up in the context of our topic because I mentioned that the Ramban was telling us about the size of the shekel, that he poskin based on, or not necessarily poskin, but he pointed out that there's a proof for the opinion of Rashi based on the weight of the shekel that he found in the 13th century. But the Tashbates, which is written 100 years later, Beshuta Tashbates by Shimon ben Zama Duran, and what he points out, he says maybe the Ramban is not correct. Maybe we shouldn't have followed the position of Rashi. Why? Because the Ramban writes himself. How did he know that this was a shekel? He wasn't even able to read the writing on the coin. He had no idea what coin this was. He says that he showed it to the Kusim. And the Kuthites, they were the ones who explained it to him and proved to him that this was a shekel. So what the Tashbates writes is the Kusim, in the world of Halacha, the Kusim are not reliable in Halacha. There's a whole parak in Nida about the Kusim and what their religious beliefs were and when we can rely on them and when we cannot. And the Tashbates claims that there's no reason to rely on the evidence and the testimony of the Kusim as to this being a shekel. Maybe the Kusim are lying to the Ramban. Maybe there's some sort of a hoax here, a scandal here. And the Tashbate says because of this doubt, so we shouldn't rely on this for evidence. So I mentioned before the reason of Lo Bashamayim, maybe that's one reason not to rely on archaeology. But a second reason we're finding here is because the discipline itself is flawed. That when you find something, you find some sort of a specimen or an architect, a relic, that you're really relying on the expert to interpret the results. But the expert is really prone to mistake or prone to, God forbid, lying to you. So the halachic process should protect itself from that and not rely on such a person's testimony. So it's worth pointing out that, there are from archaeologists, we do have other versions of the shekel. So in each situation, you'd have to figure out if that claim would be valid. But it's one flaw in the archaeological method that we should consider before we take something into consideration, la halacha. The second example I wanted to bring with you is something a little earlier in history. Is called the Cobway skull. I'll show you a picture here of the Cobway skull. The Cobway skull was found in 1921 in the city of Cobway. I'm slipping my mind which country Cobway was in. And this skull, well, this is not a hoax. It doesn't seem to be a hoax. This is a real skull they found. They think it's important in trying to figure out pieces of the puzzle of evolution, maybe some sort of an earlier humanoid type of creature, the Cobway skull. And the Cobway skull is, the experts in archaeology presume that it's close to 300,000 years old. And we're not going to get into that topic of the age of the universe and archaeology in that regard. But one of the things that's interesting about the Cobway skull is if you look here, there's actually a hole. I don't know if you can see it, but there's actually a hole in the Cobway skull. And they found this in 1921. And some were a little confused as to how this hole could have formed in the Cobway skull. How do you have a hole in the Cobway skull? It actually looks very much like a bullet hole, because the way that the skull came, there was a hole in the skull, and on the other side of the skull, the bones were damaged. So that's often what would happen with a gunshot wound. It would penetrate the skull, but by the time it came to the other side, it would fragment it and break multiple parts of the bone. But obviously, this Cobway skull, assuming it's from 300,000 years ago, we wouldn't think that they had any rifles to shoot a bullet through somebody's skull. So, you might think, oh well, it's probably not a bullet. They probably threw a spear. They probably threw a stone. So no, it doesn't seem like that's the case, because when you, I mean, this is a little bit morbid, but if a skull would be hit by a rock or by a spear, it wouldn't be able to penetrate the skull fast enough. It would break the skull at the point of impact. The fact that this projectile, whatever it may have been, went through the skull and broke the other side makes it seem like it was going significantly faster than any type of weapon that we have even before the 18th century. So it's a little bit humorous if you read these articles. This is not mainstream opinion in archaeology. Some suggest, oh, maybe they had some sort of a rifle back then that was lost and recreated later in history. That's possible. Maybe the Cobway skull is actually from someone in the last 200 years. That's very hard to imagine, because the Cobway skull it's not a Homo sapien. It's not a human being as we know it. It's some other type of species. So it was kind of a mystery. They didn't really know what formed this hole, because both of those possibilities seem absurd. And this was in 1921 when it was discovered. But more recently, we have actually been able to discover exactly what caused this hole. That what caused this hole was not a bullet, and it's not a recent bone from anyone. But what actually caused this hole was a bacterial infection. It's actually been found in other artifacts after 1921 that I don't know, someone could Google it later to figure out exactly what the bacteria was, but it was some sort of bacterial infection that occurred, may have been even in the person's lifetime, that caused the skull to erode and create this perfect hole, not because a bullet went through it, was because of a bacterial infection. So my point of bringing this example again is to show that sometimes when you find an archaeological discovery and you try to interpret it, so even if everybody means well, even if everyone's being honest and trying to interpret it truthfully, what they think happened, their conclusions could be way off. Because when you find something, you find a relic, you find an artifact, you really just have one tiny little piece of a puzzle. That the archaeologist and the historian's job is to complete the rest of the puzzle. To take that one piece and figure out and create a whole story around it. But it's very easy to make a mistake. If you didn't know how bacteria works and how it could erode a skull over time, so you can reach an absurd conclusion that will not only not be helpful, but will be hurtful in order to discover history. And trying to find a halachic example of this, there's an interesting comment by the Drisha. The Drisha is written by Rav Yehoshua Falk in the 16th century. It's a commentary to the Torah and the Beis Yosef precursor to the Shulchan Aruch. And the Drisha in Siman Lamed in Orach Chaim is the laws of Tefillin. And the Torah and the Beis Yosef there discuss the order of the parchments of tefillin in the tefillin shel rosh. Your tefillin shel rosh, for those who wear tefillin, have four parshios, four parchments that are placed inside of it. And there's a famous machlokas, it's what we call the machlokas Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, as to what the order of those four parchments should be. Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, two of the parchments, they agree on the order, and the last two, they argue which order the two parchments should be placed. And this is a famous machlokas. Some even wear two sets of tefillin in order to fulfill both opinions, wear one at a time or wear them both at the same time, in order to fulfill the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. So this is a famous machlokas Rashi Rabbeinu Tam that some are even concerned about till this day. And the Drisha, Rabbi Yeshua Falk in the 16th century, he quotes from the Smag and the Mordechai, who write that there was a letter sent to them from Israel that they found by the kever of Yechezkel, the grave of Yechezkel, of the Navi, that they found a pair of very old tefillin. And they investigated the tefillin, and it was written according to the opinion of Rashi. So they found this. I don't know I wasn't able to dig deeper, find the history here, see if we have this tefillin, see if we know about the grave of Yechezkel, if anything was found there. But at least in the 16th century, there was a tradition that a letter was sent that those in Israel were able to find this kever, and they found a pair of Rashi tefillin. And of course, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam are having their machlokas in the 11th, 12th century. If you know what type of tefillin that Yechezkel wore, or the people in Yechezkel's time wore, so then I think you would back down on arguing with Rashi if you knew that that's the way that the Nevi'im wore their tefillin. But the Drisha says it's not approved. And he says that it actually doesn't contradict Rabbeinu Tam at all. Because Rabbeinu Tam would tell you, why were these tefillin buried? You only bury tefillin that are invalid. When you have a puzzle sefer Torah, you have a book that you don't want anymore, you have something that's bad, so you put it in shemus, you bury it underground. So the Drisha suggests, so maybe Rabbeinu Tam wouldn't be bothered by this finding from 1,000, 2,000 years earlier. He would just suggest that that was a puzzle pair of tefillin. There was something wrong with that tefillin, so it was buried underground. But everybody who wore tefillin during that time may have worn tefillin like Rabbeinu Tam. So it's possible, I don't know. But it proves our point that if you just have one little piece of evidence and you try to build a whole puzzle around it and say, we found this tefillin, we can reach a conclusion about what everybody was doing at the time. So you might be mistaken. You might reach the wrong conclusion. Maybe that was the pair of tefillin that was put in shemus. So it's possible. So you see that when you're studying archaeological record, you can't just, if you find one thing, so you might reach the wrong conclusion. There's actually, and this is relevant to our discussion with the Ramban, the Abarbanel in Shmos there, in Parshas Kisisa, he actually takes issue with the Ramban as well, that the Ramban, I mentioned that the Ramban said he asked the Kusim, he found the shekel, and was able to prove that Rashi's position was right. And we mentioned that the Tashbeit disagreed. The Tashbeit says, no, we don't listen to the Kusim. The Abarbanel doesn't take issue with listening to the Kusim, but he takes another issue. He says, no, everybody knows that if you find a coin from 1,000 years ago, that the coin will start to wear away over time. And the fact that your coin weighed 16 grams, whatever it may have been, according with the opinion of Rashi, doesn't mean that that's what the coin originally weighed. A coin could have weighed much more at the time, and the coin lost weight over time as, got eaten away at. So he says that's not good evidence. You're not able to learn anything from there. So again, this is a little questionable for us now in 2020. We actually have many shekels that have been found like the Ramban's. We have the exact shekel that the Ramban found and know what it looked like. So once you find a lot of them, it's hard to claim that they all changed their weight or that the Kusim were lying. But it's actually interesting that when it comes to Pidyon Aben, which is requires a certain amount of money, in determining the weight of the shekel, the Shulchan Aruch does not seem to follow the opinion of the Ramban. I don't know if it's because the Shulchan Aruch didn't have the writing of the Ramban and his addendum to his commentary on Chumash, but for whatever reason, we don't seem to paskin like the Ramban. So despite the archaeological evidence, it seems that some of these claims are significant. Maybe Lo Vashamayim, maybe we're not going to change our Psak Halacha based on old finding. Maybe there's question with the transmission. Maybe there's questions trying to fill in the blanks. So it's interesting that it's not such a cut and dry topic in figuring out whether we should care about archaeology when it comes to halacha. Just a couple more examples in the halacha. There's another famous machlokas about how a mezuzah should be placed. That there's some of us think of it as a machlokas Ashkenazim and Sfardim, whether it should be put at an angle or put directly straight. The actual machlokas and the Rishonim, in understanding the Gemara tells us it shouldn't be placed as a bolt. What does it mean as a bolt? So one opinion says that a bolt is up, down, vertical. The other says a bolt is horizontal. So one opinion says a vertical mezuzah is puzzle, invalid. Other says the horizontal mezuzah is invalid. So these are the two opinions. That's why Ashkenazim put it at the angle, because hopefully no one will invalidate it because it's at the angle. Only if it's vertical or horizontal are you entering into this question. But the original machlokas was whether it should be vertical or horizontal, the mezuzah, and the other one would be invalid. So there have been those who write, and you can find both directions, that they've found mezuzahs from previous generations in history, and they found it vertical, they found it horizontal, and they seem to have proven which opinion is correct. But everyone who writes about that and seems to have proven it seems to be mistaken, because we found mezuzahs from many different generations and many different times in history, and we find them in both directions. So what it really seems like is that maybe this machlokas Rishonim was really an earlier machlokas. That maybe this machlokas, whether mezuzah should be vertical or horizontal, didn't begin in the 12th, 13th, 11th century, but was really a machlokas going way back, and even in different communities, they had different customs. So again, you see that when you try to reach a conclusion based on the archaeological evidence, you may be mistaken if you don't have the entire picture. I'll end us off with the tshuva of Reb Elyashiv, when Reb Elyashiv discusses the tchelas. So his claim about the tchelas, the reason Reb Elyashiv discouraged the tchelas, at least the reason that he has in writing, is Reb Elyashiv points out that this isn't the first time that anyone's tried to claim that they figured out what the tchelas was. The Radziner Rebbe thought that he discovered the tchelas. There were those after him, the cuttlefish. And he said, just as the earlier generations were proven to be wrong with further searching, so too might happen with the Murex trunculus, that what Rav Schechter might think is tchelas, and others might think are tchelas, or the experts might think are tchelas. Maybe they'll get it wrong. Maybe they're really mistaken. Maybe in another generation, we'll find something else that seems to fit the description better. So, an interesting argument. We can give a 3-part series sometime on tchelas to discuss the different arguments that are brought as to whether we should wear tchelas, not wear tchelas. But just one piece of the puzzle about the archaeological evidence. Even though I personally wear the tchelas strings, I'm a student of Rav Schechter. I find the archaeological evidence to be very compelling. We found Murex trunculus in many different places throughout Israel. But be that as it may, there are compelling sources throughout our tradition, not just in the last 100 years, but in the last 500 years, in the last 1,000 years, even in the times of the Gemara, that there are many sources that seem to show that it's really not such a cut and dry topic. It's not so clear that we should be following the archaeological evidence. So it's a fascinating topic to see how rich the literature is on this, and that it's not just a modern question of archaeology, but really a question that goes way back, and really one that continues to be a machlokas until this very day. All right, I thank you all for joining me this evening and for joining us on the shiur. And thank you again, Rabbi Rothrex, Rabbi Turk, and everyone for helping arrange this.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Hoberman. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yeshua.
Thank you, Rabbi Hoberman.
What's his name? Let's say so. Who's that? No? I thought Rabbi Yabla would say something.
The one in
It's interesting.
yes, they are trying some lately.
9:12.
I don't know if it's real or not real.
9:12.